We now invite to the stage 3 senior U.S. government officials whose work over the years encourages a culture of innovation at USAID, the Defense Department, and state. Respectively, Ms. Ann-May Chang, Executive Director of the U.S. Global Development Lab, Mr. Frank Kendall, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and Ms. Rose Gottemuller, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security.
Excuse me, let me get mic'd up. Hey, how are you?
And the theme of this fireside chat will be the democratization of technology and how emerging innovation trends impact strategic environments.
Well, let me start with you, because you heard some of the discussion about what it can do for development. Tell me what innovations you're doing in the development sphere that come from technology.
Sure. So this is an exciting topic. I'm thrilled to be here today. One of my colleagues at Canadian Grand Challenges says, innovation is the path, but impact is the destination. I think we always want to keep our eye on that destination as we look at innovations. And so what we're doing at the Global Development Lab and across USAID is we're trying to open up development to the ingenuity of people around the world, whether they're a student or an entrepreneur in a developing country, that we've seen phenomenal ideas come from unexpected places and from bringing diverse minds together. And so, we have innovators such as, the teenage woman in South Africa who came up with an innovative way to do gardening, to create these strips called Real Gardening that helps to both save water in a drought-prone area in how they plant seeds, as well as create jobs for women in the area. We have just astounding breakthroughs we saw earlier in the film, like with the household solar systems that are providing energy for people living in rural areas off the grid through micropayments, through mobile payments that allow them to pay off a few cents a day, less than they would spend on kerosene, to get clean, reliable solar energy. And so we think the potential for innovation in development is really astounding, and we're starting to see transform people's lives.
Undersecretary Kendall, the Pentagon, or even before that I should say, the Defense Department and War Department, from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, was probably the most important driving force for innovation in the world. It created everything from ARPANET to what got spun off as NASA, everything from microchips to computers to networks, all come out of innovations there. Is the Pentagon still such a driving force? If not, why not? And is there anything you would do to change that?
It's not. It's not for several reasons. First of all, it's the globalization of technologies. The technology distribution around the planet has leveled out enormously. Also, the investments in technology are much more on the commercial side now than they are on the defense side. So cutting-edge technologies that have military applications, and you mentioned processing, you mentioned the use of the internet. These things are such commercially important tools now. They're such part of our daily lives that those innovations are happening much more quickly in the commercial side. If you just look at the numbers, the amount of resources that are being invested in new technology outside of security, outside the Department of Defense is huge compared to our budgets for technology.
And does that mean then that you have to partner with companies, corporations?
It does, and that's one of the reasons Secretary Carter's established a Defense Innovation Unit Experimental in Silicon Valley. It's designed to the technology would flow into our products at some point just because of competitive pressures. What we're trying to do is accelerate that process, because our opponents around the world do have access to those commercial technologies immediately as soon as they're available in many cases. So we want to bring them into our products. And when we have long cycles of development time, for example, for major weapon systems, it's difficult for us to do that. So there are a number of things we're doing to make that process start sooner and be much more efficient as we bring technology on board.
Undersecretary Gottemuller, innovation is such an overused word that's been sapped of its meaning to some extent. Can you tell me what you feel innovation can mean, especially in a place like the State Department?
Well, I have particular responsibilities. I'm the undersecretary responsible for arms control. And so weapons of mass destruction control and elimination around the world, that's my responsibility. But frankly, you know, we've been stuck in the past when we think about how we monitor arms control agreements. We still focus on the big birds to do, observation of Russian ICBMs. And that's where our mindset is when we think about verification of arms control treaties and agreements. So I have been excited in recent years by the potential of the information revolution for the future of monitoring arms control treaties and agreements. Just think, for example, of the potential of big climate data for understanding where illegal effluents are flowing out of a factory if you're concerned about chemical weapons development. Just think about the potential of ubiquitous sensing, monitors dispersed on mobile platforms for tracking what countries are doing with their nuclear weapons. These are things we really need to think about. I even think about the challenges of, autonomous weapons. At the end of the previous session, there was a mention of autonomous systems developing, and people are really worried about autonomous lethal weapons emerging in the future, some of them very tiny. But sensors are getting smaller and smaller also. So we can't just throw up our hands in the arms control world and say, we can't monitor these new problems. We have to throw out our old mindset and think about what the new potential gives us for monitoring arms control treaties and agreements.
And how does that new technology affect the type of arms that we're going to have to monitor? I mean, are you going to have to be able to do verification of cyber treaties?
That's a very good question. I actually don't think there is a direct crossover between arms control treaties and agreements and cyber. People talk about cyber arms control, but when you're talking about cyber, you're not talking about physical objects in the same way we talk about controlling weapons of mass destruction. So you have to think about it a little bit differently in terms of how you try to control and manage the cyber challenges that are out there, the cyber threats that are out there. In the first order, we really have to get the whole international community to cooperate on establishing some normative principles so that everybody does understand how dangerous cyber threats can be in the future, and try to get governments stepping up to the same kind of normative principles. We've made a great deal of progress on that in recent years. But then we can think about other measures, simple measures to cooperate and build mutual confidence. We've already got some early cooperative measures to exchange information about cyber incidents and so forth. So there are some things we can do in the this kind of old arms control space, but I don't want to take it to the level of actually placing kind of physical limits, because you can't do it in the cyber realm. You have to think about other approaches to policy in the cyber realm.
Well, that's very interesting, because the 60s and the 70s, 80s even, were dominated by at least strategic relations were dominated by arms control talks, And that was pretty easy to do. It was almost a chess game that was a proxy for many other things.
Those missiles are really huge.
Right.
So, yes.
What lessons are there and what lessons aren't there for how we should be dealing with China and other nations when it comes to having arms control talks, when those arms are bits and bytes and technology and cyber as opposed to missiles?
Yeah, these are all very good questions, and there are crossovers, as I mentioned, between and among these various spheres we're concerned about: cyber, space, weapons of mass destruction, new conventional weapons, and Frank can talk to this much better than I can. But I think we need to really, first of all, we need to acquaint countries like China, because they weren't in the old game from the 70s and the 80s. It was a Soviet-U.S. game. Now it's pretty much a Russia-U.S. game to control nuclear weapons. So we're trying to work very closely with the countries that have nuclear weapons, China, UK, France, Russia, and the United States, in addition to India and Pakistan, to begin to develop some mutual understanding of the importance of restraint, number one, where weapons of mass destruction are concerned, and number two, to begin to take some baby steps toward introducing them to arms control and reduction processes. But again, I want to stress that, first of all, we need to break out of the old patterns of the past and think about what the potential of new technology can help us with this in this space. And second, we need to be aware that not everything that we did back in the 70s and 80s is appropriate today for trying to get a handle on things like cyber threats.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Kendall, if the North Koreans, and I don't want to get into whether they're the ones who did the Sony hack, but let us stipulate, I can ask a hypothetical question. If some country like the North Koreans, which sent a cyber attack into a corporate headquarters and part of the American economy, if they had sent a missile and it had hit U.S. shores, Secretary Carter would have come to you and said, what arrows do we have in the quiver to shoot back? What are we doing now to figure out what arrows we'll have in the quiver for the new types of attacks we could be having?
Being able to shoot back gets into some very classified things very quickly. But obviously we want some tools like that so we can respond just to have the deterrent value. And we want to make sure that anybody who's contemplating something like that has some concerns about what the response would be. And we try, this is more in DeRosa's world than the State Department's world, but you try to be proportional when you talk about things like that so that you don't get into an escalatory conflict. Cyber is a ubiquitous problem. Cybersecurity is a ubiquitous problem. And it's brought about by the fact that we're all connected today. And we were talking about in the previous interview, in ways we've never been before. And it's terra incognita. We don't know how vulnerable we are in some cases. We don't know what kind of threats to expect. And it's constantly moving. There's a huge malware industry out there that's generating weapons essentially continuously. And we have made great strides, I think, in the Department of Defense to protect ourselves. Secretary Carter would say that his first concern is protection of our networks because our ability to conduct operations depends on that. But again, there's a lot of unknowns about that. An opponent who wants to use a cyber weapon against us can implant that weapon and leave it there for as long as he wants to and then use it at the most devastating time. So that's the sort of problem that we're dealing with. We've done a lot to try to protect through encryption, through various and sundry technologies. I was just in San Francisco yesterday with Secretary Carter getting briefings from 4 or 5 of the companies that the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental I was talking about is working with. I think 4 of the 5 were in general in the area of cybersecurity or the use of the internet as an intelligence tool for one reason or another, through one technology or another. We're in an era where technology is changing very quickly, and it's changing nowhere more quickly than the cyber world. So staying ahead of the adversaries in this world is incredibly difficult. And again, it leaves us with a situation where, in the case of increased tensions or the use of a weapon, we have the zero-day problem fundamentally. Yeah. That is pervasive throughout everything that we operate right now. Now, we've taken advantage of the connectivity, but at the same time, it's made us vulnerable.
You just said that technology is changing everything and that nowhere is it changing more fast than in the cyber world. In 5 years, somebody will be on this panel and say, technology is changing so fast and nowhere is it changing more fast than in the biosphere. Right. So what are you doing to get ahead of that?
We're working that too, and I'm glad you made that point because cyber is at the point where it's well known. It's a technology that's proliferated, and a great many people can take advantage of that technology and use it. Biology is not quite there yet. Biology is at a deeper level of innovation, where you need very, very specialized knowledge to build the tools to manipulate biology to get what you want. In some areas like genetic engineering for crops, it's further advanced. I was at MIT recently getting a briefing on some of the earlier technologies there. Secretary Carter was just up there also. We're very interested in doing more work in that area. But it's still, in many cases, at an area where it's very, very deep knowledge is required. But once those tools become available to broader audiences and are usable by broader audiences, there'll be a surge of innovation of a different type.
But wait, I mean, CRISPR technology within 2 or 3 years will be able to allow any organization to create a virus. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean cyber virus, I mean like Zika virus that could infect a population.
That's the sort of breakout from a deep, very specialized technology to one that's more widely available and uses a tool to create a lot of different things. And there is a great concern there. I think it is, you're probably right, in that cyber is at a certain stage of maturity. We understand that threat to a certain level. We're doing things about it. But the bio world, and I know Rose is very worried about this, represents a whole different challenge.
Absolutely.
Can I just real briefly? I mentioned that in the cyber arena, we're wrestling with establishing international norms and principles so that everybody's got the same mindset, at least in governments. We're not talking about non-state actors here, but at least in the bio realm, we have a well-established international convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, which has its weaknesses, I will grant, but at the same time, it does establish that clear normative baseline principles that countries they will eschew biological weapons, essentially. And there's an international, of course, system that goes along with developing ways to implement those principles. The Biological Weapons Convention is just having its annual its 5-year review conference this coming December, and a lot of these issues will be on the agenda there to try to wrestle with. Again, it's not a silver bullet, because again, there's no verification and monitoring. It's been impossible because of the fast movement of bio throughout our age. But nevertheless, I do want to stress that unlike cyber, there's a great deal of international consensus around the necessity of avoiding biological agents and means as weapons of war.
And May, let me try to get a silver lining on this cloud by asking whether biotechnology and even the big data that comes around biotechnology, how that could change for the good the world of development.
Yeah, and we're actually several steps behind because we're working in developing countries. And so in development, we look at new technologies more through the lens of opportunity than through a threat. And when it comes to things like cyber, we're still looking at places like in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where only 20% of people are online. And so the upside and the potential for getting a lot more people online and giving them access to the information, to the economic opportunities, to the productivity tools that would help them lift themselves out of poverty is tremendous. And at the same time, as we see the continued proliferation of mobile phones, the expansion of the internet, which is continuing to happen very quickly, we're also recognizing that disadvantaged populations risk getting left further and further behind. So a lot of people, while we see the incredible progress of mobile technologies and internet in Africa, don't necessarily realize that there's probably almost twice as many men online as women in Africa, and almost 3 times as many men online as women in India. This kind of divide also exists between rural and urban populations. So if you think about the most disadvantaged people, who might be women in rural areas in developing countries, they were really being left behind as the world moves forward into this kind of cyber-connected world.
You just threw together mobile and online as if it were the same thing. Is there a distinction that can be made, especially in the third world, about what mobile technology can do, leaving aside, quote, being on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So today we have more mobile subscriptions in the world than we have people. That doesn't mean everybody has a mobile phone, because several of us have more than one of them. But in developing countries, more than half of people have a mobile phone, and most people have access to a mobile phone through a family member. When it comes to internet access, that is still relatively low in most developing countries. As I mentioned, in Africa, it's only about 20% of people that are online and using access to the internet.
So how are you leveraging mobile specifically?
Yeah, so mobile, which is much more expansive, has much broader adoption, has incredible powers as well. One of the, I think of as killer apps for pure mobile without internet access has been mobile financial services, the ability to transfer money just through SMS, essentially, from one person to another. This has been, this has really taken off in places like East Africa. We're starting to see it take off in other parts of the world, and it's provided people who have never had access to financial services before so many more powerful tools. So now they can transfer money if one of the family members goes to work in the city or goes overseas. They can transfer money back without paying exorbitant fees. They can actually start saving money without having to put it under their mattress and risk it being stolen. In some cases, they can get loans so that farmers are able to buy fertilizer to grow their crops. Or they can get insurance, microinsurance, so that if their crops fail because of a drought, they're not completely devastated. And so the kinds of tools that are available to people and starting to become available through these mobile financial services, we see as one transformative effect of mobile phones.
We often think of development as being where we have great resources and we help bring them to other people. But I listen to what you're saying, and it fits into a pet peeve I have, which is that in some ways what's happening in East Africa and others is so much more advanced than what's happening here. That we were talking a moment ago about the kids in Baltimore, or whatever it may be. One of the biggest problems we've found in our work is that kids are underbanked. But they can't transfer money easily with an SMS. They can't they can't get a cell phone necessarily because they don't have a credit card. What can we learn from the way mobile technology is being used in East Africa and India that could help us in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, because in developing countries there's a lot of leapfrogging happening. People never got wired phone connections. They never got wired internet connections. Everything's wireless. And so the kinds of technologies and solutions that are emerging in this ecosystem are very different from what we have here.
But when we come to innovation, we are somewhat stymied, say, by the banking system we
Yes.
have here. They're not quite so. What's preventing innovation, say, in the finance space when it comes to mobile technology?
Well, certainly regulation slows down certain kinds of innovation in developed countries where there are much stricter regulatory regimes in effect. But we're also starting to see us adopting some of those things. Things like Venmo are making it much easier for people now to be able to, especially young people, to be able to transfer money via their mobile phones and via just SMS here. So we're starting to see those types of things be adopted. But I often think that one of the biggest drivers of innovation is scarcity. You know, when people are in a place where they don't have another option, you know, new inventions emerge to fill that gap. And so we see so much ingenuity being tapped into because there isn't something there. In the United States, we have a lot of solutions. They may not be perfect, they may not be as easy, but because there isn't that scarcity, you know, we're seeing some of the other countries really leapfrog us in some of these cases.
Let me ask both of you then, what are you doing to drive innovation from ideas that you're coming from the outside, other countries, private industry?
We're trying to create a climate which encourages it, first of all. Change always encounters resistance in an organization. So one of the things we're doing is trying to make it more attractive culturally, if you will, for people to bring forward ideas. We're pushing experimentation and prototyping a lot. We're doing a lot of that. We put a lot of that in our budget this year. One of the reasons that Secretary Carter wanted to start DIUX was to bring that entrepreneurial culture more into the department, so people got exposed to that and get a sense of what that's like and started to kind of bring some of those values in. And the other thing, of course, is we have a pretty strong motivator right now. We alluded to it indirectly earlier, but the threats we see in the world are getting much more severe. The proliferation of technology that I mentioned is one of the factors that's on that. The rise of China in terms of their wealth is another. Russia's aggressive foreign policy at the moment is another. So we're motivated by the threats we see, and that's probably as big a motivation as it can be for people within the government and within the uniformed services and the people that support them directly. For industry, it's largely financial. And one of the biggest problems I have with industry right now is not a lack of innovation, it's a lack of resources to bring innovation into the products that we actually use. We have a valley of death, we call it, where we fund technology and we have an awful lot of good ideas there that get matured to a point where they're ready to go into a product, but we don't have the resources to actually put them in a product. And frankly, I have that problem more today than I do any other problem as far as advancing our weapon systems.
And is that because of the bad budgeting practices or sequestering or what?
It's sequester is at the heart of it. It's limiting our budget by an artificial mechanism like that, which really has no correlation to our national security needs. And the other thing, of course, is all the competing demands. We're engaged in very active operations against ISIL today. We're still very engaged in Afghanistan. We're worried about terrorist groups around the world. We still have problems with Iran and North Korea, their potential behaviors, and obviously Russia and China at the higher end. And what we try to do in our budget submission this year was shift more towards the higher end threats because we see them as becoming longer term, much more of a concern. But at the meantime, you can't let go of all the other things that you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
I got two problems. First of all, as far as, again, controlling weapons of mass destruction are concerned, a lot of people think that problem went away with the Cold War. So there's a kind of, ho-hum, this isn't an urgent problem that I have to address in terms of catching interest in looking to the future and developing new technologies for verification. So that's the first problem. The second problem, which always gets thrown back at me talking about these topics, is negotiability. How are you going to get the Russians or the Chinese or whomever to agree to some of these more innovative approaches to monitoring and verification. All of those are very, very good questions, but the reason any country enters into an arms control deal is they want predictability about what the other guy is doing. And so I think over time we can deal with the diplomatic challenges of negotiability for some of these measures. But the first problem's a little bit harder to deal with, and we constantly face trying to get people excited again about controlling weapons of mass destruction. Because everything we've been talking about this morning is how urgent the problem both is now and is going to become. So how do we interest the populace? How do we interest young people? And the way we've gone about that is to try to ignite excitement about the potential of new technologies in precisely the verification and monitoring arena. We've run 2 competitions now to see if we can pull forth some good ideas from from the student community in particular. A third competition we're going to be launching in April in cooperation with colleagues out at Stanford to look at new potential for monitoring the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So there are a lot.
What's the best idea that's come from the students?
Well, the best idea actually was a tool for inspectors that would help an inspector. You know, when you go on an arms control inspection, like in a Russian nuclear facility, you've got a limited time to see what you need to see, and then you need to be out of there. That's all written into the treaties. We don't want Russians wandering around our facilities any longer than they want us wandering around their facilities. So it's all treaty constrained. You got to know exactly where to go. So the best, most interesting thing was a tool for inspectors that would allow them to really understand going into a facility what kinds of questions were emanating from the facility. Okay, I need to go to that room because there's something there that I need to look at. So that kind of thing, I think it's kind of nerdy, but I thought it was really exciting and a very good tool for inspectors.
And so from opening, what about crowdsourcing the ideas of inspection and crowdsourcing inspection?
Well, we have been interested in trying that, and actually I was out at South by Southwest 2 years ago to talk about some of that, and there have been some good ideas that have already emerged that are applicable, like the radiation detectors. You can turn your smartphone into a radiation detector by downloading an app, and it's already being used by the public. A lot of this is already happening in the environmental sphere. For example, the public around Fukushima is monitoring, radiation levels there today, and it gets fed into a central database. So there is some of this that is going on, but it's thought of more in the world of environmental monitoring with public participation than in the world of arms control monitoring. And there you've got problems. I mean, once again, worried about, are the Russians going to like it if the public's helping to track their ICBMs? Probably not. So we have to think about other ways to use ubiquitous sensing in those cases.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry to keep pushing on you, but this is interesting to me. You said earlier on that the biggest problem was, not the biggest, but the emerging problem was the non-state actors, and yet you've talked about arms control agreements in bio, cyber, and conventional and nuclear and everything else, dealing about how you get Russia back into the mindset and China to learn the mindset. Is it possible to make arms control treaties with non-state actors, and are you thinking innovative ways to do that?
No, we don't want, and this I'm speaking very firmly as, a diplomat and a policy person, we don't want to invest them with legitimacy of sitting across and negotiating an arms control deal, with them. But I think there are 2 ways that we go about this. First of all, and here I think the benefits, again, of the information revolution can help us in 2 ways. They can help us to better define the threat. They can help us to better understand what is happening. That's number 1. They can help us better understand where there's an illegal production facility for fissile material, for example. So we need to make full use of those tools. We need to understand the threat. That's an intelligence function, something governments can and must do. And then I think new technologies can better equip us to go after those kinds of threats.
And May, we were saying, 5 years from now when we say technology is changing everything and nowhere is it doing it more fast than, cyber, than bio. Another would be data analytics. How has the change of data analytics and information processing, to give it a simpler term, changed the type of innovation you can do in development sphere?
So given that a lot of people are, in developing countries are still living in fairly primitive, data-poor settings, I think the applications are fairly limited now. The place that we're seeing the most application has been with mobile phones and call data records from mobile phones. And so people are, that's where the vast amount of data for people who are living in very poor circumstances is coming from. And so we're starting to see some really interesting experimentation there. We're seeing companies looking at call data records and being able to analyze them to detect usage patterns of when they're, are they regularly topping up their phones and so forth. And
Are they regularly? I'm sorry.
In developing countries, most mobile phones are what they're called prepaid.
Right,
So
so
you actually have to put in money
Right.
on your phone, so you quote unquote top it up.
Topping, yes.
Yes,
Got it.
and then when you top up your phone, you have some more minutes to use. So looking
Correct.
at the patterns of how you're topping up your phone, how you're using your phone, they've been able to correlate that with a sort of credit scoring. And so being able to give loans to people based on the way that they're using their phones. And so mining that data and seeing the patterns and correlations of if this person's really able to top up their phone on a regular basis, they maybe have enough of a stable flow of income that you could give them a loan and expect them to be able to pay it back, for example. And so things like that are really starting to help open up, again, the financial world to people, which is a critical factor when you're living on less than $2 a day. A financial catastrophe, whether it's a drought, whether it's a health emergency, can completely devastate a person and their family.
In mining this data, I'll ask all three of you, how do you balance the privacy concerns? Frank?
We're basically constrained by policy and law, and we just follow the rules, essentially. For us, it's not a question of making up rules ourselves. We're basically constrained. It is a problem, and I think we have the case right now with Apple, obviously, right, where there's a law enforcement conflict with privacy. I think we're just going to continue to wrestle with this and try to get the balance right. And I think the balance will probably shift depending upon how concerned we are about the threats. The more frightened we are, the more we're going to sacrifice some degree of our privacy. But as far as the Defense Department's concerned, we basically just try to stay within the rule set that's been defined for us.
As far as the issues for arms control monitoring and verification, I already mentioned the one that some governments are not going to like it when, or if their public were involved in these kinds of activities. So, for example, if Fukushima had happened in a different kind of country, would the central government of that country like it if the public were involved in monitoring the radiation around the plant? So you see the problems there and the dangers associated with public involvement. I did want to mention one case where I think the government of a country could invest the public with a cooperative program in this realm, and that is if there was actually a ban on a particular weapon type, and they wanted to prove to the outside world, prove a negative essentially, that they had no more such weapons capability, and then investing the public to help them convey, that nowhere in the country is that capability available. So there are, I can think about for the future, some possibilities where government and public could come together on these kinds of monitoring goals. But it is a very, very delicate matter, and also one where I wanted to point out legally there are still many, many questions to be answered.
Let me open it up, please, if I may. Yes, sir.
I have a question. With innovation and with trying to get our people to be more innovative inside of government agencies, what are some techniques you are using individually from state, DoD, and USAID to recruit and retain the best talent instead of engaging with private sector to increase innovation?
Recruiting talent in the space of innovation and technology.
We've just announced a series of initiatives called the Force of the Future, which includes a number of things that are intended to do that. More freedom in terms of how we compensate people, reducing some of the barriers to bringing people in at mid-career and finding ways to encourage people to do that. The department tends to have a workforce, both in uniform and civilians, who've kind of grown up their entire careers with the department. And one of the obstacles to moving back and forth, and I've seen this transition in my own career, is revolving door constraints that we have. which I think are too severe, frankly.
In other words, you can't go to Intel and back.
It's too hard to come in and go back out. And we used to have very, very talented, best and brightest people in government. They'd come in from industry for a few years, they'd make a contribution to their country, and then they go back. And nobody assumed that they were a crook. I think we've gone too far trying to protect ourselves from the rare person who's really going to do wrong. And we deny ourselves an enormous amount of
Yeah,
time.
in the golden days of the Pentagon, when Robert Lovett and others were coming in.
I came in on the tail end of that in the 80s.
Yeah,
So
they
this
were
is
coming
what
in and
closed
out
the
of everything from Pan Am Airways to
Yeah.
the Union Pacific Railway, but also Bell Labs in and out. What's stopping that? Is it
it's
you have to
a-
sell your stock? I mean, what could, if I were Senator Warner and I wanted to put something in and help fix
a lot
it?
of it is post constraints on you afterwards, and there are a lot of rules that apply to this. People have to go get advice by a lawyer when they leave, particularly if they're involved in my world of procurement. You can't, for a period of time, come back and represent a company to the government, for example. You can't work on certain things that you've been involved in. So
Wait,
it
wait, so
really
you're talking about the
discourages
lobbying rules? Is that the biggest problem?
I would call it marketing versus lobbying from the
Okay.
point of view of industry, but it's similar. Lobbying has this connotation. But it used to be very common for people to come in and go back and enhance their careers. It made them more valuable in the company. It also gave great service to the government. It's just harder to do that nowadays.
I agree. The problems are very much the same, although on a smaller scale, obviously, at the Department of State. And I want to draw a contrast between the Foreign Service, our diplomatic service. They come in, they have a career, and that is a whole different kind of career train that goes on. There's a lot of innovation going on there, too. They're bringing in people at mid-career, people who have been out and done different things. There's a lot of emphasis on that. But for my organization, we have physicists. The Iran deal, the JCPOA, the verification of that deal was worked out by physicists working on my staff. And so the problems there, they're also structural problems. People want to come and go. They want to spend some time in academia. It's just difficult. The same problems Frank pointed to. But the other thing, I'm finding there are barriers to getting young people in. That if I need to hire a physicist, it's easy enough. Well, it's not easy, but anyway, the authorities are there. The potential is there to hire a mid-career or more senior physicist. But to get that young, bright star coming right out of school in and begin them in a State Department career working on arms control matters, really difficult. So we are wrestling with this matter
And
right now.
what two or three things to fix that? Is it salary?
First of all, getting the authorities.
Okay.
The hiring authority is the first thing. And so we are working on that. And the secretary and our deputy secretary, Heather Higginbottom, is very invested in this. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We need that new generation coming in. Because I've got a lot of very senior people who are getting ready to retire, and we need the young people coming up through the ranks. So the authorities, I would say, first and foremost.
One of the initiatives we have is, actually it's a presidential initiative, the Defense Digital, it's the Digital Services, U.S. Digital Services. The defense version of that is Defense Digital Services. And these are people who've had, worked at LinkedIn or Google or wherever, who have had a startup maybe and made a fortune and would like to give back to the country. And so they're coming on for nominal salaries, and they're working for a couple of years on a tour of duty to come work on some specific problem. That's sort of nascent. It was started relatively recently, but that's a way to get some really top-notch talent to come work on some of our problems. And
That sounds like a really good idea.
I have a team right now that's out at one of my defense contractors teaching them modern software practices, I believe.
Because it wasn't a question so much of salary, once you've made your money because something's going public.
Post-economic
But how do I
is the term.
give back a couple, 2, 3, 4, 5 years and come into government? And hope we can do that. Did you want to add? Or
Yeah, I think
Okay.
digital services is a great example. I've spent some time with the digital services team, and you feel like you're in Silicon Valley when you're hanging out with this group, right? And it's phenomenal the kind of talent we've been able to bring in from across technical companies. At USAID and the lab, we've really been pushing a few different mechanisms to try to bring in different types of talent. So, because we think it's so important to have that mix of talent within the agency. So one is through the AAAS Fellows Program, the Association of American Advancement of Sciences, and that we have rocket scientists, PhDs who are coming in with all different types of skills there. And we also have a new authority that the lab's been pioneering at USAID that I think is the same authority that Digital Services uses, using called Schedule AR, which is bringing in experts from industry into both the lab and across the agency. And those have given us a little bit more flexibility, but it's only a part of what we want. It's a start, but we still need, I think, a lot more flexibility than we have today.
Could I mention one other thing here, and that is, I think we do need to find ways for young people, particularly, they're going to want to come and go in their careers. We need to tackle this problem that Frank talked about, because people are not going to want to stay, in the same organization, making their career up to, the highest, whatever SES level. They're going to want to come and go in their careers, and we need to make that happen.
I can introduce you to the people at LinkedIn right there, because that is something we're going to have to figure out in our society. The fundamental change of, even somebody in my generation, I joined Time Incorporated, in 1979 and left sometime like it's 2003. But that's not happening anymore. And how can the LinkedIn world be fit into the government bureaucracy world? Yes, sir.
Lawrence Greger from Mill Suite, DoD side of the house. We're joint between some agencies and DoD on connecting people, just like for DoD, like LinkedIn does in the public world. Some of the things that I've been seeing working on ideation and innovation inside defense are that knowledge management, talent management is across OPM as well as it is DoD. But where I'm finding a disconnect is between open data transparency, knowledge management silos of excellence versus silos of sharing, and connecting the people, Defense Innovation Network with DTNF. If the government finances solutions, we can replicate these innovations, and this is a great start. But how do we get the right minds looking at the ideation, the innovation, and sharing things that are replicatable immediately and scalable across the DoD and all government?
Yeah, the question is pretty much just about silos and sharing across silos. Frank, Mr. Silo.
One of the things I'm trying to do in the area of particular of business innovation is we're constantly trying to find best practices out there and bring them in and proliferate them across the department. I don't think I have a shortage of innovation at all, but I think I have inefficient mechanisms to spread it out throughout the rest of the department and to share it with people. And I do think we have a workforce which has younger people coming in, as Rose mentioned, who have a very different attitude towards a lot of things. And there's a lot of untapped potential there. Our bureaucracy tends to finish up on the previous subject about hiring and so on. It takes us way too long to make somebody an offer. I'm going to be just a little heretical for public servants to talk about this, but I think we have over-centralized processes way beyond what they should be. At the end of the day, managers should be allowed to hire people. If they're not good managers, they shouldn't be in a position where they would have that responsibility. But we've over-centralized things, which adds an enormous amount of time to the process. Hiring an SES has become a nightmare, as far as I can tell. And getting someone who's not an SES already through the qualification process and so on, which is done by committees, basically, who review paperwork. That's totally divorced from the reality of how people actually hire. Anyway, I'm venting a little bit.
Especially if you're recruiting somebody who you might have competitors who's going to try to, United Airlines versus you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to end with a question that Alan answered so well at the end of the last session, Alan Blue sitting there, which is, in 5 years, what innovations do you see coming and do you want to see coming when we get back on this stage 5 years from now? And May, let me start with you.
So again, in development, we're looking at we're a few steps behind everyone else by the time the innovations really proliferate. I see in 5 years from now, we're going to have so many more people online, connected in developing countries. That's going to be...
So will the data analytics help change the way you allocate resources?
Absolutely, and I think one of the innovations, and this is not a technology innovation, but that we're really interested in is how we incentivize innovation. So today, most of the ways that we fund programs are by funding activities, and what we want to do is start funding outcomes and start funding impact. And I think what that will do is really unleash innovation. Because people will be optimizing to increase outcomes as opposed to doing the same activities over and over again.
And I'd love you all to build on something she just said, which is when you talk about what innovations you're looking for in 5 years or whatever, give me one that's not just technology, because innovation is a lot more than technology.
Very good point. And for us,
Well,
it's often operational concepts. It's how the technology is employed. which gets to the tendency to resist change in our operators who are used to doing things a certain way because they've done them that way all their careers. If you know anything about the history of technology in military and operations, you know that military institutions tend to take technology and use it to enhance doing things that they've already been doing, do it a little bit better. They don't see often the revolutionary application of that technology to do things in a completely different way. I think we're probably at a point where there's some opportunities like that coming. A technology we really haven't mentioned very much is kind of the combination of autonomy and artificial intelligence and what that's going to enable from a military perspective. The proliferation around the world of precision munitions is the thing that scares us right now as much as anything, because we're so reliant on a small number of high-value assets. I think there's going to be very major change in not just how we equip our forces, but in concepts of operation. And I think it's going to be fueled by a combination of technologies. But I think autonomy and artificial intelligence are going to be at the heart of that.
That's huge. Last word.
I'd like to take what have become no-brainers in industry and apply them to the tracking of weapons of mass destruction and their control. You know, Amazon.com, FedEx, they track billions of items a day all over the world. They know exactly where they are. Again, we got to deal with negotiability. We got to deal with where things, you know, where government's heads are at. But we've got stuff going on in industry to track small objects. It's a no-brainer. So why can't we think about combining some of those concepts with the problems I've got controlling weapons of mass destruction?
This was totally fascinating. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.